Didn't happen.
Okay, it's good to be back after
Was it your wedding?
a hiatus of, was it 2 weeks we were off?
Yeah, 2 weeks.
2 weeks. Okay, we finished Masechet Erechim last time. We move on in Seder Kodshim. We're up to Temurah. There's actually a few Masechtot now that there's only like 1 or 2 shiurim per Masechtot. There's small Masechtot with not a lot of Agadita, but the good thing about Ein Yaakov is it doesn't really matter. It's just, each sugya is its own kind of contained unit. So, Temurah Daf Yudal Amud Bet. What we'll be talking about today is a specific pasuk that doesn't. It's strange trying to understand what it means. We'll see how the Gemara understands it, how the Seder Olam Rabbah understands it, and then how the Rishonim go into a lot of detail. Trying to kind of make sense of the implications of it. And then we'll look at the end at some other midrashim to kind of see what the takeaway is on a more of a kind of musar or ethical level. So the context is actually the story in Shmuel Bet Perek Tetvav about the rebellion of Avshalom. Okay, the Gemara kind of gets to this as part of a discussion about Nazir, and we'll see it ties back to the halachic context of Nazir. We'll see that later. But as part of that, Avshalom is described as having long hair, and he's assumed to be a Nazir. So we'll just kind of review the psukim at the beginning of his rebellion, where he rebels against his father David HaMelech. There's one pasuk in particular which the Gemara has a hard time with. So let's just kind of refresh our memory. The third source here, Shmuel Bet Perek Tetvav. Okay, so Avshalom, he gathers together some chariots and horses and kind of a crew of people to run out before him. Okay, so Avshalom used to get up early, he'd go stand by the gate of the city, and anyone who'd pass by that had some grievance against the kingdom, he would normally go to the king to adjudicate the dispute. So Avshalom would meet him on the way and say, "Where are you from?" He'd say, "I'm from such and such place." And Avshalom would say, "I understand what you're saying. You're right to be upset, but you won't get a kind ear lent to you from the king." Right, so Avshalom said, if only I were, king or in charge, then I'd make sure that people like you, would get a fair trial and that you'd get what you deserve. And then, he would kind of kiss the people and he'd hug them. Right, Avshalom, he's playing politics here. He's trying to slowly become a populist leader, win over the crowd, and turn them against his father, the king. Okay, and then this is the pasuk that really concerns us. So at the end of a 40-year period, Avshalom goes to his father, the king, and says to him, "Let me go fulfill my vows that I vowed in Hebron. Okay, the details are not so important, but basically this is a pretext for him to go and start active rebellion against his father. And the idea of the neder is where the idea of Nazir comes up. But the point that's strange to us is Vahi miketz Arba'im shana. Okay, and what are the Arba'im shana being referred to here? Okay, at the end of 40 years, Avshalom begins his rebellion against his father. So the problem is, you would assume that this means at the end of the 40 years of David HaMelech's reign. That would be the most logical initial assumption. But David HaMelech reigned for 40 years. And there are stories that happen after this, right? There's a bunch of, and we'll see this dealt in detail in Tosfot. There's a few episodes that come later in Sefer Shmuel that we know must have taken some time or happened sometime after this. So it doesn't make sense, at least on the surface, to say that this happened at the end of David's reign in the 40th year, at the end of 40 years, because that's when David HaMelech's reign was expired. So what are the 40 years being referred to here? So now we go to our Gemara and Temurah and Daf Yudal Amud Bet. Abayim Shana Leman. What is this 40 years marking? So Tanya Rabbi Norai Omer Mishum Rabbi Yoshua Miketz Abayim Shana Sheshalu Lahem Melech. So it marks the end of 40 years since Bnei Yisrael asked for a king. Tanya, it's taught in the Braita, Ota shana sheshalu lahem melech, ota shana asirit shel Shmuel hayta. That the year that Bnei Yisrael asked for a king was the 10th year of Shmuel HaNavi's reign. Even though he was a Navi, not a king, but his rule. Ezer shanim malach Shmuel batzmo. So Shmuel reigned for 10 years. Achat shemalach Shaul Shmuel. There was 1 year where Shaul and Shmuel both kind of reigned together. Shtaim shemalach Shaul. Shaul reigned independently for 2 years. Batzmo. U'shalshim v'sheva shemalach David. And then David is 37 years. So if you count, right, the Bnei Yisrael asked for a king. Shaul said, okay, here's Shmuel said, great, here's Shaul. Shaul reigned for 2.5 years. Okay, and then after that, David HaMelech reigned for 37, a bit more than 37 years, and that's the Miketz Arba'im Shana. So this is happening towards the end of David's reign, according to Rabbi Norai, but it's not at the end of 40 years, it's around 37 of the 40 years into David HaMelech's reign, because you subtract the 2.5 years of Shaul's reign and some of Shmuel's reign. Okay, so that's how the Gemara makes sense of this.
Why is it not 28?
28.
He says 10 years Shmuel, and then 1 year of both of them, or 27. 10 years.
Because it's saying when Bnei Yisrael asked for a king, that was 10 years into Shmuel's reign, not the beginning of Shmuel's reign. No, Shmuel was a prophet for 10 years. After 10 years, Bnei Yisrael come to him and say, we want a king, just like, the Goyim, right? We all know that story. So you start the count from that point. Now, as you say, okay, from that point when Bnei Yisrael asked for a king, 40 years later is when Avshalom rebelled. At least I think that's how you understand this. The Gemara in Nazir has basically an identical teaching. Hani Arba'im Shana Maya Viditayu. What are these 40 years being referred to? Rabbi Norai Mishum Rabbi Yoshua. Leketz Arba'im Shana Shaul Lahem Melech Tana Ota Shana Shaul Lahem Melech Hi Shnat Eser L'Shmuel Ramati. Okay, it's the same idea. Okay, very nice. Where's Rabbi Norai getting this idea from, and why do we care? What does it help? It explains maybe perhaps 40 years from David's reign doesn't make sense, but what's going on here? Why would the Psukim count it from when Bnei Yisrael first asked for a king? What's the significance of that? Okay, so we'll try to get to that, but first we'll go through a lot of I'll say detailed chronological calculations, okay? So Seder Olam Rabbah is a good place to start. Perek Yud Daled. Vayimi Ketz Arba'im Shana Vayomer Avshalom Ki Neder Nadar Avdecha V'Gomer Hi Shnat 37 L'Malchut David. Okay, this is what we saw in the teaching of Rabbi Norai, that this happened in 37 years into David's reign. Rabbi Norai Omer Mishum Miketz Arba'im Shana Leketz Shalu Yisrael Tamlucha Hi Shana Asirit L'Shmuel HaRo'eh. Okay, here's referred to as Shmuel HaRo'eh instead of Shmuel Ramati. Very nice. מכאן אתה מחשב שבין 12 שנה היה שלמה במלכו. And Seder Olam Rabbah is basically Seder Olam Rabbah is all about the years and the ages and calculating those types of things. So it uses this teaching of Rabbi Norai to infer that Shlomo HaMelech was 12 when he was king. How so? Vayishlach bi'ad Natan HaNavi v'gomer. Okay, so that is the story of David HaMelech being punished for what happened with Bathsheba. Okay, beoto perek v'yacharei chen ul Avshalom ben David, and then after the story of Bathsheba, that's when Avshalom first comes onto the scene and begins his rebellion. Vayhilish natayim yamim. There's a pasuk there that says 2 years later, for 2 years, Avshalom barach. Avshalom basically fled to Geshur for 2 years. Vayisham shalosh shanim, and he was 3 years in Geshur. Harei chamesh, so that's 5 years. So basically, what is Seder Olam Rabbah doing? It's saying that Shlomo HaMelech was born. The story with Bathsheba then led to when David HaMelech reconciled Bathsheba. That's when Shlomo HaMelech was conceived and born. And we see that so you have 2 years after that, Avshalom then flees and is 3 years in Geshur. He's abroad. So that's 5. Vayeshev Avshalom b'Yerushalayim shnatayim yamim u'pnei HaMelech lo ra'ah. And then he comes back and he didn't see David HaMelech for 2 years. Harei Sheva, that's 7. V'yerav b'mei David. Okay, and then Avshalom's whole rebellion happens. Okay, and the assumption is Shlomo HaMelech is 7 at that point. V'yerav b'mei David shalosh shanim. So then you skip ahead after the rebellion of Avshalom. There's a separate story towards the end of Sefer Shmuel that there was a famine in the lifetime of David. It was 3 years. Harei Eser. Vayishtu b'chol haaretz vayavo miktzeh tisha chodashim. Right, David sends out Yoav and this group of people to camp. So they come back nine months later. Harei Yud Aleph Shana. Okay, so that's already 11 years. Uvashana Achona Itkin David HaMelech Mishmarot Kuna v'Leveyan. And at the end of David's life, in his last year of ruling, he established the Mishmarot of the Kuna and Leveya. V'Yisdir Kol HaBayit. And he got the whole the Bayit ready. Uchtiv B'Shnat Arba'im L'Malchut David Nidushu V'Gomer, as we learned from Divrei Yamim. So from there, Seder Rabba derives that Shlomo HaMelech was 12 when he became king, because that's when David HaMelech died. Shlomo HaMelech became king. Just as an aside, that makes sense because we find right after Shlomo HaMelech becomes king, the first story is where Hashem appears to, he brings a korban, and Hashem appears to him and says, what can I do for you? This is the famous story where Shlomo HaMelech says, I don't want honor, I don't want power, I want wisdom, right? I want a wise heart to judge the people fairly. And it says Hashem loved his answer and said, even though he didn't ask for any of those other things, I'll give them all to you in addition to the wisdom that you asked for. So in that story, Shlomo HaMelech describes himself as a nar. I'm only a nar, I don't have wisdom. So nar is, a young boy, a lad. That makes sense with the 12 years that Seder Rabba here is trying to derive. Okay, be that as it may, that's kind of an additional derivation from the teaching of Rabbi Norai. Now let's look at the Mefarshim, okay? So the Maharsha in his comments on the Gemara in Nazir says as follows: Temurah Perak Bet Misayem Ba Eser Shana Shemalach Shmuel. Okay, so that it's the 10th year of Shmuel, 10 years of Shmuel's reign. Shana Achat Shemalach Shmuel v'Shaul. There was a year where Shmuel and Shaul reigned together. Uvet Shemalach Shaul Betzmo, and there's 2 years that Shaul reigned by himself. By the way, how does the Gemara know that Shaul reigned for 2 years? That's a pasuk. Right? There's a pasuk that says that Shaul's reign was 2 years long. ו-37 שמלך דוד. He says, ואין פי רש"י, שאבשלום היה יודע שעתיד דוד למלאות 40 שנה וכולי, אין שם. ודברי נביאות הן, לפרש שתלה מרד אבשלום, ושאלו להם מלך בימי שמואל. שמזה נטל אבשלום עצה למרוד במלכות אביו, כמו שמרדו ישראל, לשאול להם מלך אחר שמלך שמואל עליהם. כמפורש בקרא, דחשיב להם מרידה. So the Maharsha is trying to explain what's the significance of tying this 40 years back to when Bnai Yisrael asked for a king. And he basically argues that when it says, Vayhi miketz Arba'im shana, that this is almost prophetic. It's saying, Vayhi miketz Arba'im shana, in the sense that Avshalom knew somehow that his father David would reign for 40 years. And he saw in that the significance of 40 years from when Bnai Yisrael asked for a king, that indicated a need for a change, like a revolution, a change in the monarchy. So that's how he understands that. Okay, let's get into the weeds now. Rashi, in his comments on Nazir, Daf Yamin Aleph. Okay, here we're going to refresh our memory of a lot of details about Shmuel and the first kings. Hishnat Esther the Shmuel Ramati. Okay, so that's the 10th year of Shmuel's reign. Shav Shalom Yodeh She'atid David Lemalot 40 Shana. Knivelu 40 Shana Shalu Yisrael Melech Miyom Liyom Acher Shemalkol Shmuel. So that's what the Maharsha quoted. V'Shaul Dahainu B'Tchilat HaMalchut V'Alta Lishnehen V'She'adayin Lo Yatzat Tiv'o Shel Shaul Ba'olam V'Af Tiv'o Shel Shmuel Ba'olam She'an Nikra Melech Lo Pasak. Okay, so he's explaining that there was this period when Shmuel and Shaul kind of reigned together, because Shmuel, even when he anointed Shaul, Shaul doesn't immediately take the throne. There's a period where there's kind of this overlap between them. Okay. Ushtayim shemalach Shaul b'atzmo b'chayei Shmuel. So the 2 years that Shaul was king were in the lifetime of Shmuel. Shmuel was still alive. Notice Shmuel abdicated his throne. Even though he wasn't the king, he appointed Shaul, and Shaul was king while Shmuel was still alive. K'mo shelamadnu b'seder olam. Shlomet Shmuel lifnei Shaul ela 4 chodashim. Here, that the Seder Olam Rabbah teaches us that Shmuel died 4 months before Shaul. Okay, and there's this famous story of where Shaul, he goes to consult he brings Shmuel back from the dead. He goes to consult the Kshafim. What's it called? Ov, right? Endor, right? So that happened between the lifetimes of Shmuel, after Shmuel died, before Shaul died. So Seder Olam Rabbah derives that happened in this 4-month period before Shaul himself dies in battle the next day. Okay, V'lamed Zayin Shemalach David And then David HaMelech, it was 37 years into David HaMelech's reign. V'ta'av Avshalom v'amar achshav higia ha'ket shel Abba. So Avshalom thought, okay, this is the end of David's reign, because he had this knowledge of 40. And he thought, okay, 40 from when the kingship first began, versus 40 years of David HaMelech's reign on his own. Achshav higia ha'ket shel Abba v'elcha lechevron lesiv li sham al-melucha. So I should start my rebellion now. ואם נפש אדם לומר, מניין אתה אומר שאותה שנה שמלכו שמואל ושאול, שהייתה בתחילת מלכות ששאול ושמואל, לומד לפני שאול 4 חודשים, מכאן אתה למד שבאותו יום שעלתה חנה לשילה, דכתיב ואלי הכהן יושב על כיסא, באותו יום נתמנה לשופט. והיינו, דכתיב ישב על הכיסא. So from here we derive that the day that Hannah, Shmuel's mother, went to Shiloh, right, and that's where she davened for Shmuel, and Eli heard her. He thought she was drunk. That whole story. So the pasuk says Eli was the Kohen. He was sitting on his chair. So the derivation is Yashev al Kiseh, meaning that was the beginning of his reign. V'hainu dichtiv Yashav al Kiseh. V'lemanu shebota shana nit'abra Chana v'yalda Shmuel. And we know in that very year Chana became pregnant and Shmuel was born. V'ne'emar bo b'Shmuel, and by Shmuel the pasuk tells us, Vayeshev sham ad olam shel Yovel 50 shana. So basically, it says by Shmuel HaMelech, Shmuel HaNavi, that he reigned for ad olam, which is understood to mean like with olam by the Evet Ivri, it means 50 years, the Yovel. So a period of 50 years that Shmuel was there. In the Beit HaMikdash, right? Veshev Sham Ad Olam, but he wasn't taken there as a baby, right? Chana says, let me take him home and let me nurse him, and then I'll bring him when he's old enough, after he's weaned, and dedicate him to the Beit HaMikdash. So, Shtei Shanim Shigmalatu Imo. So there were 2 years where Chana weaned Shmuel, and then she brought him to Eli, and then he was dedicated to Eli, and that was for 50 years. And that's how we know that Shmuel HaNavi lived for 52 years. Ve'eli kama shani nitmana Yisrael, 40 shana. And we know that Eli was a king for 40 years. How do we know that? Ukshayalo le'eli 40 shana ben kama shani maya Shmuel, haveyomer ben la'ametet shana. Right? So if we understand that Eli became king the very day that Chana came, and Eli thought that she was drunk, because he was shev al kiseh, so that means Eli began his reign 1 year before Shmuel was born. And so if Eli reigned for 40 years, that means Shmuel was 39 when Eli's reign ended. Right? So that means that there were 13 years left, right? In other words, from when Shmuel was born to when he was 39, Eli was the ruler. Then Eli died when Shmuel was 39. We know Shmuel lived to be 52. So from 39 to 52, there's 13 years that Shmuel is alive after Eli has died. Tsemen eser shemalach Shmuel. So you take the 10 years that Shmuel reigned from 39 to 49. Achar mitato shel Eli, after Eli died. V'nishtaru lahen shalosh shanim. V'zoi shamru achat shemalach Shaul u'Shmuel u'shtayim shemalach Shaul be'atzmo. And that's when we saw in the Gemara that, okay, so I had 10 years of Shmuel on his own, and then 1 year we overlapped with Shaul, and then 2 years where Shaul reigned on his own, but Shmuel was still alive. So what Rashi is doing here is he's couching this, he's giving much more support to this teaching in Temurah by giving you the broader context of also the reign of Eli and also his mother Chana, and saying that it works with all of the years of the previous psukim as well, in terms of why the Gemara understands that Shmuel reigned for as long as he did. It also, what's nice about this is two things. One is that based on all of this, it means that Eli reigned for 40 years. And that's nice because we like when there's reigns of 40 years. David HaMelech reigned for 40 years. Shlomo HaMelech reigned for 40 years. So that Eli also reigned for 40 years, it sits nicely with us. And also it means that Shmuel was 52 when he died. That also means, if you remember in Seder Olam Rabbah, Shlomo HaMelech was 12. According to Seder Olam Rabbah, when he became king, right? He was a Na'ar, he was 12. And the Psukim tell us that Shlomo reigned for 40 years, which means that Shlomo would have been 52 when he died like Shmuel. So Rashi's derivations here also create like a lot of these parallels between kind of the earlier generations and the kings. That Eli reigned for 40 years, David and Shlomo reigned for 40 years, and that Shmuel lived to be 52 and Shlomo lived to be 52. But all of it actually makes a lot of sense with the psukim. It's just kind of taking the psukim and bringing them to logical conclusion. So that's Rashi. Tosfot elaborates a bit further in his comments in Nazir and in Temurah. So let's see what he says in Nazir. Perish shana. Lemalchut beit David, right? You can't say when the pasuk says vayimi ketz Arbaim shana that means from David's reign. De'az marad Avshalom deha mashma cry deha malach chamesh shanim achar ma'aseh zeh. Right? The psukim imply that David HaMelech was a king for 5 years after Avshalom's rebellion. Gimel shel ra'av, right? There's at least 3 of famine. And that we saw that pasuk before. V'achad shemana Yisrael. There's one where he counted Bnei Yisrael. V'achad she'amid mishmarot. We saw that in Seder Olam. U'mishane miketz Aarbaim shana sheshalu lahem lemelech. And so the Gemara answers, no, it's 40 years, not the 40th year of David's reign, but 40 years since Bnei Yisrael asked for a king. Shemardu b'malko shel olam. That they rebelled against the reign, not of David, but the reign of the Melech of the whole world, which is Hashem, by asking for a king. בכלל. תלה מרידת אבשלום בשאלתם להם מלך, שהיה שנת 10 לשמואל, ובחצי י"א העמיד מלך, and then he appointed Shaul in the middle of the 11th year, ומלך חצי י"א ובית שנים, הרי ד' שנים, לשאלה. And here Tosfot makes a diuk, ובתחילת למ"ו למלכות בית דוד היא. So he says this means that would have been in the beginning of the 36th year of David. היא שנת מ' לשאלה. ואחר כך מרד אבשלום. והשנה היא שנת רעב, וגם אותה שנה וגם אותה שנת 40 לשאלה. ואפילו מראה בתחילת שנת 40 לשאלה, ולאו דווקא מקץ מ' שנה. Tosfot says, right, if you remember the Gemara said in Temurah, right, it says, ו-37 shemalach David. Right, that I say, okay, I have the 40 years, so I have 2 years of Shaul, 1 year of Shaul and Shmuel, and then 37 of David, that makes 40. Tosfot basically says that that's a Taut Sofer, the 37. He says it's actually supposed to say 36, because 37 doesn't work, because there can't have only been 3 years left in David's reign after the rebellion of Avshalom. The Psukim say explicitly that there was a famine for 3 years, and they say that there was a year or 9 months where he went and counted Bnei Yisrael, and then there was a year where he was Ma'amid Mishmarot. So he says even if you want to combine those and squish it together, you say it's 4 years and change, you still aren't getting to 3 years. So it has to be Shloshim v'Shesh, and not Shloshim v'Sheva. So that's Tosfot's Girsa change on that Gemara. And he says that explicitly in his comment in Temurah. So Hachi Garsina, this is how we have to have the Girsa. Vaynu 40 shana, mi sheshalu lahem melech, bishnat asirit l'Shmuel shalu lahem melech, haya min haminyan shel 40 shana, u'minan d'Shmuel shafat Yisrael yud gimel shana, harei kshemet Eli. Okay, and here Tosfot adds another layer of analysis to what we said. Az nishba ha'aron. Okay, so remember what Rashi derived was that Shmuel's reign began when Eli died. Right? That once Eli died, Shmuel was 39, and that's when Shmuel's reign began. So he says, how do we know that? Because the Psukim tell us a story about when Eli died, what happened. And I don't know if you remember, it's a story where the Plishtim actually came and stole the Aron, right? In battle with Bnei Yisrael. And then they came and told Eli. Eli says, what happens? And they say, your sons died, and we lost a lot of people in the battle against Plishtim, and also the Aron was stolen. And it says, when Eli heard the Aron was stolen by the Plishtim, he fell back and he died. So remember, that's 40 years after he began his reign. So that whole story is actually, just as an aside, that story, the Plishtim stealing the Aron, there's psukim there, where it says, then Bnei Yisrael go and they get the Aron back. It goes to Beit Shemesh, and there's this whole story. But then they fight against the Plishtim and they win. And the psukim say that the Plishtim, all the land that the Plishtim had conquered up until Gat, that they had taken in the Gvul of Yisrael, Bnei Yisrael then went back and got back from the Plishtim in that war. And it's if you read the Psukim, it's it's almost, let's look at it very quickly, because I saw it and I was like, oh wow, it's okay. It's just God is in this area. But the Psukim, I don't know if it's service, but we'll just pull up a Tanakh quickly. It's just worth reading these 2 psukim, okay? This is in the aftermath of that battle about the Aron. So these are the psukim, okay? Shmuel Aleph. Okay, it says. This is here. Okay, that's the stuff. Sorry. Okay, there's a whole battle with the Plishtim. Where's the story? No, it's not that. Sorry. I saw it just the other day, and it was just like, oh, wow. That was great. The Plishtim had sent back the Aaron. No. Okay, I'll find it later. Oh, here it is. Okay, it says, "Vatashuvna ha'arim asher lakchu plishtim me'et Yisrael liYisrael me'ekron ve'ad gat ve'et gvulam hitzil Yisrael miyad plishtim." So all the cities that the Plishtim had taken from Yisrael, inside the border of Yisrael, Yisrael then recaptured from the Plishtim all the way to Gat, and. Yeah, so if you just replace Plishtim with Mande, it's exactly what happened. In other words, they came and they conquered till Gater in that area, and then Bnei Yisrael then went and recaptured the land that was in the Gvul of Yisrael back from the Plishtim.
Are you saying that we can move to Gush Katif soon, or am I getting the message wrong?
Don't forget that Gat has returned to them afterwards because, David was a refugee, quote unquote, by Achish Melech Gat.
Right.
So, yeah. Wasn't exactly one of us.
Okay, so sorry for that tangent, but that's the story where the Aaron was captured. Okay, Dichtiv vayhi be'avi et Aaron ha'elokim v'az nitmana Shmuel, etc., etc. Okay, and then it goes through detail more. Tosfot goes through some more details about connecting the story of the Aaron getting stolen. It gives kind of more proof of how Shmuel reigned as long as he reigned. If we just skip down to after the three dots, like a two lines on the bottom, Demiyak shemet Eli nitmana Shmuel. And then how do we know that Shmuel took over right when Eli died? Because we just assumed that. Rashi just assumed, okay, Eli's reign ended and Shmuel's reign began. How do we know that? Dal Ma'amar, it says in Gemara Kiddushin, V'zarach Hashemesh uva Hashemesh, that's a pasuk in Kohelet. So, Ad shelo kafta shimsho shel Eli, zarcha shimsho shel Shmuel. So, right, when one sun sets, another sun rises, there's always there's an overlap where if the reign of one tzaddik doesn't end until the next tzaddik's reign has been prepared. And it applies that to Eli and Shmuel. Nimtza shesarato shel Shmuel itchila she'aya ben lamed v'tesha v'nimshecha yid gimel shana. That's how we know that Shmuel's reign began when he was 39 and went until he was, and then it continued for 13 years. Or really 11 years, and then Shaul was the last 2 years. Okay. Let's skip the Ralbag for a second and just kind of conclude here with two midrashim, Bamidbar Rabbah and the Tanchuma. Okay, the Bamidbar Rabbah takes us back to the whole question of Nazirut, actually, because if you remember, we talked briefly about how Avshalom had long hair, and he's taken to have been a Nazir. That's the context of I had a neder that I had to fulfill. So Rabbi Omer, Avshalom Nazir Olam Maya. Okay, there's different categories of Nazirut. So one is Nazir Olam, that you take an oath to be a Nazir forever. So Rabbi says that Avshalom was this type of Nazir. Shenemar, vayim miketz 40 shana, vayom Avshalom el hamelech el chana, v'ashalem et niduya shenadarti l'Hashem b'Chevron. Ki neder nadar avdecha b'shivti b'kshu b'aram ne'emor im yashov v'shivin Hashem l'Yishalam v'et Hashem. So Rabbi learns from this pasuk that I have made a neder to Hashem that Avshalom was a Nazir Olam. Okay, Ma'u miketz 40 shana, and then as an aside, this particular medrash says, what does it mean at the end of 40 years? And it quotes what we've seen now a few times. Rabbi Norai omer mishum Rabbi Yeshua leketz 40 shana shalu al melech, ve'ota shana shalu al melech hi shnat 10 l'shmuel amati. Okay, and then it continues, u'migalech Avshalom echad l'shneim chodesh divrei Rabbi. So I'm not actually quite sure what this means halachically, but Avshalom used to shave his hair once every 12 months. Shneimar, vayim miketz yamim liyamim asher yigalech ki kaved alav v'gilcho v'shakal et tzar rosho 200 shkalim be'even hamelech. Right, that he used to shave his head miketz yamim liyamin, which Rebbe understands to mean every year. So he was a Nazir Olam, but he shaved his head once a year. I don't know enough about the halachot of Nazirut, but I guess that makes sense. But be that as it may, he shaved his head once a year. Ne'emar kan yamim. How do I know that means a year? It says yamim here. V'ne'emar la'alan yamim tiyeh gulato. In the context of slaves, that he will be redeemed b'yamim ma'alahalan 12 chodesh avkan 12 chodesh. In that context, it's 12 months. So to here, Rabbi Norai omer megalech echad l'shoshim yom. Rabbi Norai says no. He shaved once every month. Kedech shekohanim megalchim. Because that's how often Kohanim shave, apparently. Shneimar, it says, Nichezkel uper lo yishalechu kasom yichzimu roshehem. Rabbi Yossi omer me'ev Shabbat le'ev Shabbat. No, he used to shave once every week. Shkem matzinu b'bnei melachim shegim megalchim me'ev Shabbat le'ev Shabbat. And Avshalom was a prince. He was the son of the king, so he used to shave every week. I should have looked more into how this is understood halachically in the context of a Nazir Olam, but there's an argument about how often Avshalom shaved his head. I think what they're really arguing about is how unique and special his hair was. In other words, if he shaved every week and his hair weighed 200 shekel every week, that means that he had this supernatural crazy hair that grew really rapidly.
It might be some kind of a trim, maybe, not like really, because, we all know the story of Shimshon, so I think that the whole idea is that maybe like once a year or something like that, he's allowed to trim or at least to have it some kind of, it doesn't go all over the floor like some kind of weird some kind of Nazir in India or whatever, if you hear all these crazy stories. But the idea is, I think that it's not really something that he didn't remove all his hair and then start all over again. It's some kind of getting rid of the edges.
It could be. It's a good. I just don't know enough about Hilchot Nazirut to know what it means, but perhaps maybe that's permitted. I don't know. Tzarchiyun, and I should have come more prepared on that. And then just the last source, just to finish off. We talked about what's the kind of the significance of all of this from a more kind of an ethical perspective. So. The Maharsha kind of alluded to perhaps why the Gemara seems so intent, aside from all of the proofs from the various psukim that Rashi and Tosfot brought, which make it actually seem to make a lot of sense. Actually, it doesn't seem very far-fetched to say that Miketz Arba'im Shana is referring to when they asked for the king, and it aligns nicely with a lot of the reigns, as we saw. But what's perhaps the deeper motivation behind saying it's Avshalom rebelled 40 years after Bnei Yisrael rebelled against Hashem by asking for a human king, that this idea of 40 years as being like a period of at the end of 40 years, that something happens, obviously with the Meraglim and all that. So that there's kind of a significance to that Avshalom's rebellion happened 40 years after Bnei Yisrael asked for a king. So okay, you get your king, and 40 years later, see what happens that it causes this turmoil. There's an additional layer of meaning to this whole story with Avshalom, of course, which is that Avshalom himself, right? How does he end up? How does his rebellion end up getting quashed? So his hair gets tied up in a tree, right? He's riding on a horse, and then he's trying to flee, and then his hair, which is his source of pride and glory and Nazirut, ends up getting tied up in branches, and he's hanging Ben Hashemayim Ben Aretz, and Yoav comes and beheads him. So the Medrash, it's an obvious lesson, but the Medrash derives from this this teaching of it says Ashir Hashem ki ga'o ga'ah. So it brings a whole bunch of examples in the Tanchuma of Ki Ga'o Ga'ah. It's not I'll take pride in Hashem, but that Hashem kind of brings down those who are prideful in themselves. Right? Anyone who is arrogant, Hashem brings them down, and in a way that is directly tied to the source of their arrogance. Okay, so Shekol HaMitga'im V'ma she'mitga'in bo nifra mehen. This is like an important Musar Haskel. Anyone who is arrogant, in the very thing they're arrogant about, that's how you will get paid back. All right, and then he brings example after example after example. V'chein Avshalom b'ma shenitga'a bo nifra mimenu. Shenemar Avshalom lo haya ish yafeh b'chol Yisrael le'alel me'od. Right, nobody was more handsome than Avshalom in all of Yisrael. Mikach v'raglo v'ad kod kodo lo haya bo mum. Right, he had no blemish from his foot up to his skull. Uvegalchot rosho haya miketz yamim yamim asher yigalech. That's the pasuk that we just saw, right? He used to let his hair grow out. He had this gorgeous mane of hair. He was this beautiful specimen of a person. So he was his source of pride, and the way he, aside from being obviously very politically cunning, by going and talking to people and then getting them onto his side. He was obviously very charismatic, very handsome. Like he had a way of being able to sway people towards him. And so Rabbi Norai Omer Nazir Haya ve'am megalech achad l'shloshim yom. This is what we saw before. Rabbi Yehuda Omer Nazir Olam Haya megalech 12 chodesh. And then Rabbi Omer Kolev Shabbat Haya megalech shken derech bnei melachim. It's the same opinions, but the authors of those opinions are reversed compared to Bamidbar Rabbah. Okay, very nice. וכן הוא אומר, ויקרא ושלום לפני עבדי דוד ושלום עבדי רוכב על הפרד, on the second last line, ויבוא הפרד תחת שובך האלה הגדולה וחזק ראשו באלה, ויותן בין השמיים ובין הארץ, right? His hair got stuck in the tree and he was hanging between the heavens and the earth. והפרד אשר תחתיו עבר, and the mule that he was riding continued on its way, etc., etc. He ends up losing his life because of that very hair that he was so proud of, that he was able to use, that he grew out as a symbol of his as a handsomeness. He used it in order to usurp the throne. We should always take care that if we see people being arrogant and we see them being successful, we should always have faith that eventually HaKadosh Baruch Hu will bring them down, and not just bring them down, but bring them down to the exact thing that they are being arrogant about. And that we should, take solace in that when we see others being able to be arrogant over us and seemingly be successful. We should know that their end is coming eventually.
I thought more like for ourselves, we should not be so prideful.
Gone.
But
that
you're
is
saying it should bring yourselves just
for others, and also you shouldn't do it.
It's about to come on them.
Yeah.
Well, all right.
It's interesting enough. You think if the idea is it's the pride versus.